Hey, what's up everybody? I'm Jordan. Welcome to my channel, The Crossover Appeal, where we talk about video games, what makes them interesting, and maybe even give you some recommendations on stuff you can be keeping an eye out on. And today that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, because I spent almost all of last week working my way through Steam Next Fest. If you're not familiar, Steam Next Fest is a week-long celebration of upcoming video games. And the way that Steam does this is they spotlight demos from a whole bunch of different developers. They're all free to play, free to download, and you get to try out a whole bunch of stuff risk-free. So it's a good way to kind of push the boundaries of your own taste, as well as just catch up on stuff that you might otherwise miss. And that's kind of the beauty of the whole thing to me is, you know, the video game marketing cycle and word of mouth cycle only has room for so many different games. And Steam Next Fest gives you a nice opportunity to kind of just push in, wade in, and check out what's happening on your own terms. There are hundreds and hundreds of games that get spotlit, so it can be tough to kind of pick what you want to do. For myself, I picked around 36, 37 games that I knew I was going to just try to play, going to try out, and I was able to get through all of them. And of those 37 games, 10 really kind of floated to the top. And so today, I just want to talk to you a little bit about those 10 games. For me, I tried to pick games that I had never heard of, many times never even heard of the publisher or the developer, and with one exception on this list of 10, I was able to stick to that, which I feel pretty excited about. I'm going to give you kind of the elevator pitch of the game itself, kind of like what is the thing, what's the cool idea that it has, and then I'll share 2 or 3 things that I think make it special and worth keeping an eye on. And then along with that, I'll offer one thing that has me a little bit worried maybe for that game as it comes out. But really, I'm not too worried about any of these. I think they all look at least interesting and worth wish listing. So hopefully you'll agree and you'll see some things on here that you can get excited about too. So the first game I'm going to talk about today is Deck of Haunts. So the pitch of this is you're a haunted house. By day, you expand your floor plan, upgrade your rooms. So you might have a bedroom that becomes suddenly a torture chamber. And then by night, you try to keep invading villagers away from your beating eldritch heart. And the way you do this is by playing cards. And the cards all attempt to do damage either to the invading people's health or their sanity. So it's a deck builder. It's a deck builder with some like tower defense kind of aspects to it, as well as a day-night cycle. It's pretty interesting. So some things that I think really work here, it's just a cool hook, right? How many games do you know where you can play as a haunted house? I think it's novel. I think it's interesting. I think they do a good job with the gothic atmosphere. And I think it makes sense to approach that hook from the perspective of a deck builder. I think the card playing works really well conceptually for that kind of thing. The game really feels like a tabletop game, if I'm honest. Like I could imagine playing this as a board game really easily. Another thing I think this game gets right is there's so much potential for really interesting interactions between your card play, the rooms you're making, and the individual sort of characteristics of the invading villagers. So each person that comes into the haunted house has their own specific kind of randomly generated group of traits. And those traits give them advantages or disadvantages against how you've built your deck and how you've shaped your house. I think there's a lot of interesting room for kind of tactical responsiveness to that. And hopefully they capitalize on that and make the best out of it. And then lastly, I think this is a pretty unique application of the deck building mechanic, right? Deck building, it's a mechanic that is all over the place, right? In both tabletop gaming and in video games, and for good reason. It's a really flexible framework for conveying all different kinds of tensions and ideas and scenarios. And I think this is one of those really surprising good fits for it. And hopefully, as the game kind of goes on, more sophisticated tactics will kind of continue to emerge out of that application. If there is one thing I'm worried about with this game, it's that I'm not sure what is supposed to pull me back in to play multiple rounds. The demo is just one complete kind of round, which lasts several days that you have to survive. The demo doesn't really indicate too much about what the campaign would look like. It seems like maybe there's some roguelike intentions here, but to be honest, I didn't see much of that. So if there's going to be any kind of issue with this game, I think it's going to come down to that, whether or not it can kind of spin the experience out for a full length. The next game on my list is a game called Rogue Loops, where the pitch is essentially it's a Hades-like, but with a stronger emphasis on changes to the environment and then clearer trade-offs between the abilities you choose to power up, because those will also create more difficult conditions in the arena you're fighting in. The arena is pretty unique in this game. The demo kind of has one stage, but it's split into 2, and you alternate between 2 sides of the arena through each wave of enemies. And so the things I think this game is doing really well is one is the combat. The combat just feels super good. It's already already really polished. The dodge mechanics feel good. Everything's really legible on screen. And in addition to that combat, as you level your character up, you're also adding detrimental effects to the side of the arena that you happen to be on. So for instance, when you start a wave, you might choose something that gives you splash damage when you land a heavy blow. But then that means that side of the arena from there on out maybe has only elite level enemies in it instead of the normal enemies. And then you'll go to the other side of the arena, do the wave there, and when you come back to that side, that curse will still be present, right? So the challenges accumulate even as your power does. And I think that's a nice wrinkle to the combat. It does quite a lot. The narrative framing here is also just fun. I like the idea of playing as a family of 4 who are trying to escape their own immortality. It's a nice inversion of the kind of power narrative you usually get with these roguelike style games where you're trying to escape a prison and you're getting more powerful in order to do so. In this case, the prison is this like magical power you already have. You're already immortal. The third thing I think it gets really well is it just seems like there's going to be a lot of build variability that interacts in interesting ways with all of these different environmental conditions as they build up. The demo only contains 1 character to play as, but there will be 4 in the final build, each of the 4 family members, and they all seem like they're going to have pretty different play styles. So that should create quite a lot of variability and replayability in this game. So I think it's on the right track in a lot of ways. I think it has a lot to offer. If I would say there's one thing I'm worried about here, it actually has to do with that split arena. I'm not sure if every arena or every stage will have that dynamic. It is interesting, but it did have me kind of sticking in the same space for longer than I wanted to be. In something like Hades or any other of these kind of combat roguelike games, you move pretty quickly from area to area, and even though it might be one kind of big chapter that you're in, each stage still feels unique. And in this case, because you're oscillating between 2 halves of the stage, it felt a little bit repetitive. We'll see how they handle that. It may not be that every stage is like that. It may just be this one. I do think it brings some interesting like advantages game design wise too, but at the end of the day, I was getting a little bit bored of that space by the time I was done with the demo. We'll see what they do with that. But in the end, I think this is worth keeping an eye on, especially if you are a fan of those kind of roguelike combat games in the vein of something like a Hades. So that's Rogue Loops, and it was my number 9 game of the Steam Next Fest. My number 8 game is a really interesting retro-looking game called He Is Coming. The pitch here is it's a very old school roguelike with this kind of grimdark fantasy vibe. And the whole thing is built around a countdown timer to a series of bosses until you reach this final boss. Each move you make on the map advances that timer a little bit, so you're kind of scrambling across this big open map to try and build up enough resources in order to be strong enough to take that boss on when he finally arrives. It's a really cool pitch, and it hits immediately. Like, the hook is so effective. I think this game is doing a few things really well. I think one, the aesthetic is just so well executed. It doesn't feel hokey. It doesn't feel nostalgic in sort of a, I don't know, a thin way. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like it really honors the old sort of tradition of Rogue as an adventure game, the original Rogue. Like, when I played this, I straight up felt like I was a kid sitting in front of a giant CRT monitor surrounded by like wood paneling, you know what I mean? Just amazingly well executed aesthetic. I also really love how this game pulls you into exploration. That countdown timer gives you this push-pull of needing to go out as far as you can and get the best gear, fight the best enemies so you can level up the fastest, while also wanting to make sure you still have enough health and resources when that boss finally does arrive. The other thing that's interesting here is that there's a day-night cycle where the creatures become more aggressive at night on the map. And so you can choose to either rest, which will kind of at a campfire restore your health, but then you're losing out on some turns where you could be building your character up to get even more prepared for the boss at the end of the countdown timer. It's a really interesting, clever push-pull that I haven't seen before. I think it works super well. The third thing I think this game does really well is there's this kind of challenge system that you only get hints of in the demo, but it's how this game is going to handle meta progression, and I'm really curious to see how that unfolds. It seems like there's a lot of potential for this game to go in some pretty interesting places as you get stronger and stronger run over run. I think failure is very much part of this game's design philosophy, and the challenge system seems how it's going to make those failures fun. So I'm excited to see where that goes. If there was going to be a thing I was worried about with this game, the battles themselves feel kind of lackluster. So the battles, when you actually encounter a creature, are turn-based, but they're almost kind of like an auto battler. There's not a lot of tactical stuff to do in those spaces, and you can kind of just speed them up. It's very deterministic, but it lends this game that has an otherwise pretty hardcore aesthetic, as well as like difficulty curve, that it's strange for the battles to feel so hands-off. And I don't know if I'm in love with that tension. Still, I think when this game comes out, I'm probably going to play it because the vibe was so good and the systems around exploration were so compelling. If this looks cool to you, if you're into that kind of like retro aesthetic, or just like, I mean, honestly, like gorgeous kind of art and like color palette that this game has, I'd put it on the wish list. I think it's going to be a really interesting title when it comes out. Coming in at number 7 is a really interesting little text adventure called Your House. The pitch here, I would say, is what if you just sat down to read a really kind of pulpy adventure mystery novel, but were forced periodically to solve really devilish little puzzles that kind of animate and use the literal text on the page. There's a few things about this game that really stood out to me. One, I just think the atmosphere works really well despite the kind of limited assets that are on display here. For the most part, it's just text on a screen with a few kind of illustrations along the way. There's really limited animation. The soundtrack is good, but like kind of in the background, and there's not all that much voice acting. So it's impressive how much atmosphere this game is able to convey with only those kind of few assets in play. The second thing that I think this game gets really right is how innovative the puzzles are. So the puzzles, because they make use of the actual text on screen, right? Like forcing you to sort of interact with specific words by clicking on them, forcing you to like read things in more than 2 or 3 different ways and realizing, oh, that's something I can interact with, that I can use to solve this thing that this character is coming into as an obstacle. That's just so interesting because it kind of constantly reframes your expectations for how you're interacting with a text adventure, with what is essentially a novel. Because one, you're reading these words the way you would normally read, right? For meaning, for a narrative meaning. But then you're forced to kind of pull yourself out of that narrative mode and look at the words as like objects on a screen that you need to piece together into different spaces. That constant back and forth of how you are interacting with the text is just so clever. It's so clever and I love it. And finally, I just think like the illustrations in this are gorgeous. Like they're just so nicely realized. They resemble this sort of like newspaper comics kind of aesthetic. They feel very like of the zine culture from the 90s, very DIY, while also giving that pulpy vibe of being printed on something really cheap. They're just super effective, and I think that's part of why they convey so much atmosphere, like I was saying earlier. One thing that could hold this game back is that cracking into that initial kind of set of puzzles was pretty tricky because you have to really snap yourself out of your normal mode of engaging with the game in order to access those puzzles and figure it out. And as a result, in the demo, I got stuck a couple times. Now, I'm just not very good at puzzle games, so that might just be a me thing. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's actually going to hold me back from enjoying this game. But it is something that I noticed where I was like, I can see that being a barrier of entry for some folks. So that is Your House. I think it looks really cool, really, really fun. I can't wait to see what the rest of this story is going to be like. All right, number 6 on my list is a game called Aethermancer. I would say the pitch here is what if you printed the kind of Pokemon recipe onto a roguelike framework and then gave it a just absolutely ass-kicking battle system, and then you just let the whole thing rip. It looks amazing. The pixel art in this game is so good, so juicy. The sprite work is so nice. The animations work so well. It's just like a real treat to look at. But more importantly, the combat in this game is so good. So like Pokemon, it is a monster collector. So you are fighting in these turn-based battles between your team of monsters and whatever your enemies are. But the combat itself is this cool mixture of like resource management, because each different monster you have generates one of 5 resources, and then you have to spend some combination of those resources to cast the magical abilities that each monster has, which means the system is just incredibly combo driven. It had me out here hunting for that next combo more than I was hunting for like reducing the health points of my opponents, right? To me, that's a sign of just a really crunchy, nice, toothsome combat system that can keep you stuck to a game for hours and hours and hours. And this was the demo that I played the longest of all the demos that I played in Steam Next Fest. And I think the battle system is a big reason why. In addition to that battle system, the leveling seems really cool too. Like I said, this is a roguelike. So on the one hand, there's a leveling system for the monsters across different runs. Each monster has what is called a worthiness level. And so the more kind of cool things that monster does in your run, the more worthy it is. And that will get it long-term upgrades, right, from run to run. And those cool things might be things like, healing for a certain number of points or landing killing blows, right? If you do those with specific monsters, that adds to their worthiness score. And then in addition to that, within the runs, you have a really straightforward but compelling leveling system where to get from level 1 to level 2, it takes 2 battles. To get to level 2 to level 3, it takes 3 battles, and then so on and so forth, right? So there's no way of gaining XP other than simply being present for battles. And then each time you level up, you just get a choice of one of 3 new powers for that creature. It's straightforward, but it gives you these really regular intervals of having to make cool tactical decisions in between battles too. So between the leveling and the combat, my God, this thing, it just sings. It sings, it sings. I cannot wait to see this let loose across the whole scope of this game. The scope of this game is the thing that I'm a little worried about, though, especially in respect to like the world building and the character building. What there was here just didn't seem that interesting to me. It was some kind of like mishmash of like, there's like a void that's eating away at this world, and you're a character that has a specific relationship to it. It was all very sketchy. There were like a number of NPCs that you interact with here. None of them felt super vibrant to me, which is a bummer. I'm hoping some of that writing kind of gets like sharpened once it gets to full release. But I also don't know if it's going to matter too much to me because, my God, I was having so much fun just fighting battles in this game. If you're a fan of the creature collector genre, if you're a fan of turn-based combat that's super combo driven, like something like a Persona, definitely check this game out. I think it'll be right up your alley. And then even if you just like pixel art, this is one of the best looking games I got to try out during the Next Fest. So take a look at it. It's Aethermancer. All right, we're in the top 5 now. We're going to talk about Repose. So this is an old school dungeon crawler, kind of like, I don't know if you remember The Legend of Grimrock, right? That thing where it's first person and you take one step at a time as you explore the dungeon. Make it 8-bit black and white and just dripping with some spooky sci-fi horror atmosphere. That's what we're dealing with right here. That atmosphere, I think, is this demo's #1 attribute. It feels so simultaneously oppressive and vibrant somehow, almost like it kind of gives you that vibe of watching like a late 80s, early 90s horror anime. Like it's visceral in that way, if you know what I mean. The 8-bit visuals are a big part of that, but so is the sound design, which is just kind of like squishy and glitchy, and again, like works super well. I think this game also withholds the right amount of information to encourage you to explore. The moment-to-moment gameplay here is you pushing into this kind of abandoned factory, I guess. The checkpoints are these beds that you rest in, and it's quite hard, right? The demo is like, I got to the first bed, and it took me like several tries because the enemies kill you in one hit. And so you have to be really thoughtful about how you're moving through that space. But the little bit of information this game gives you, it was like a little, I want to taste more. I want to go find what's happening here. The mystery is really, really cool. The save system and the sleep cycle is pretty interesting too. There's a sort of a roguish aspect to it where it feels like you're going on runs. I think the save system and the sleep cycle are pretty interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how they work together to create more of that tension around the exploration, about that kind of like pushing your luck to try and get to that next bed so you can sleep. It manages that tension super well. The one thing I'm worried about a little bit here is just the combat is not very good. It has this weird sort of like, you have to hit the other guy before they hit you, but it's hard to tell like exactly when that's going to be. Not much is telegraphed. And because of the sort of old school kind of one step at a time exploration of the space, the boundaries of what combat is are just pretty illegible. There were multiple times where I just got shot from like a couple squares away, and I wasn't sure why. So it's a little tricky, the combat. But at the end of the day, I don't think this game's actually that invested in the combat. I think this game is more interested in that vibe, that the kind of like fear and sense of oppression of navigating this space. And the fact that it's hard to kill and easy to get killed, I think, are actually part of contributing to that. So all things told, Repose looks just like a fascinating title. Really unique, really stood out to me. So if you're a fan of sci-fi horror, you like that kind of old school 8-bit vibe, you like that sort of old school first-person dungeon crawling experience, definitely put this one high on your list. It seems really neat. All right, number 4 on my list is another text adventure. This one is called Diacritic. So the pitch here is you're investigating some very shifty dystopian corpo stuff that's happening, and you're investigating it from the position of an office worker at the corpo that's doing the sneaky stuff. So the way this game presents is you're sitting, it's like an operating system of your computer that you have at work. So you're sifting through emails, you're responding to those emails, you're reading training documents, and then in between all those things, you're doing these menial tasks, which essentially are like these weird kind of wireframe shape rotation puzzles. So the game splits things between this kind of puzzling portion of the side of things and then this kind of fictional, text-based, metafictional narrative that you're interacting with. Number one, the writing in this is so high quality already, right? It's gripping, it's tense, the different voices that are being written, whether it's like your boss or your trainer or your colleague, they all sound and feel really different. And when I say sound, I mean like when you read them on screen, because there's no voice acting in this game. It's just really high quality stuff. I'd say the central mystery here also just feels immediately compelling. I love that sort of storytelling where you're someone on the inside and you're trying to kind of just like maintain your job, your new role here, while also looking into and investigating this pretty nasty stuff. There's also like a lot of stuff here about this theory called diacritical thinking that plays this almost kind of Scientology style training, psychological manipulation role in this space that you're learning on the job, even as you're investigating how those things might have contributed to some pretty bad stuff. The other thing that I think is super interesting about Diacritic is just that juxtaposition of the puzzle versus the text. The way those are being interwoven here is pretty interesting. The puzzles feel almost meditative in nature, and you get kind of this break in between a really dense sort of like metafictional reading through a bunch of training documents and like responding to emails session. Then you go to these like shape rotation puzzles, and interspersed between the puzzles are additional kind of like journal entries from whoever you're investigating for the company that you work for. But the moments with the puzzles lets you kind of soak and marinate in what you just read. It's an odd, but I think really effective meditative back and forth that I haven't experienced really anywhere else. The thing that is bugging me a little bit in the back of my head here is it has slight Lost vibes. And what I mean by that is I can't quite tell if this is actually going to go anywhere. It might end up being the kind of thing that's just a little too obsessed with its own mystery and not as interested in telling a full, fun, interesting story. I do think, though, there's enough direction in this demo that they are really heading somewhere pretty interesting. So at the end of the day, I'm really got my fingers crossed that this game's going to come through for us here. If you like kind of experimental fiction, if you like sci-fi and dystopian writing, don't miss this. Like, this is one to put on the radar. The puzzling, I don't know, if someone is more into puzzle games than I am, or would comment in here how it hit them. I thought the puzzles were interesting, but I don't know that I would just play the puzzles. Do you know what I mean? Like, the puzzles worked for me because they were letting me have the space to kind of contemplate the more fictional, like, writing aspects of the game. But maybe you feel differently. I think they worked, is what I'll say about the puzzles. So anyways, that's Diacritic. I've got it wishlisted. Maybe you should too. All right, we're down to the top 3 demos I tried during Steam Next Fest. This next title, I think it's really special. It's called Inhuman Resources, a Literary Machination. The pitch here is basically face down a million terrifying ethical dilemmas as a down-on-your-luck worker starting a new job at a secretive company where it turns out the main thing it does is global political manipulation through horrifying psychological experiments. Like, it's quite a premise, man. It's another text adventure or visual novel. I guess more of a text adventure than a visual novel because there's not a lot of visual to it. It's really the 3rd game on this list that's mostly text, which is odd. I don't actually play a lot of those kinds of games. But this one, man, it just nails this like spooky atmosphere. The sound effects and the music help with just supporting this really atmospheric writing. It's also got a surprisingly gruesome mood at times because the vibe of the game from the start is sort of, I don't want to say it's like lighthearted, but it's kind of wry, you know, it's like quippy, it moves quick, but then out of nowhere, it just punches you in the mouth with some just like really gruesome stuff. And I think that juxtaposition just like is super effective. And I'm hoping that it continues to use that to play with the mundane nature of the evil stuff that it's interrogating. I think the protagonist here also feels really relatable, which is nice. He's just like kind of a dirtbag. He reminds me a little bit of like a younger millennial, elder Gen Z version of Harry from Disco Elysium. Sort of like sarcastic, but just honestly kind of desperate and so willing to take a job like this, even sight unseen. And then, like I said, the sound design choices here are just really smart. There's screams that hit kind of in a muffled way, or on the other side of a room that your character has just walked into. The kind of Art Deco graphic design is backed by these sort of like 20s and 30s kind of hotel lobby music that comes in and out sometimes as well. Just a really nice overall contribution to the atmosphere from the sound. I do think if there's something that is holding this game back, it might be the lack of voice acting. Each of the characters has this kind of voice actor that's doing a sort of Simlish kind of nonsense talk. It works okay, but if I'm honest, I would really love that to be either voice acted or not voice acted at all. I just think the garbly sort of nonsense words, it just doesn't work for me. That said, it's a small quibble because the rest of what I saw in this demo, I could not get enough of. I wanted to play the rest of this game immediately. So that is Inhuman Resources, a literary machination. All right, number 2, and that is Yes, Your Grace, Snowfall. So this is the sequel to the, I think, 2020 or maybe 2022 game, Yes, Your Grace, which is like a kingdom management sim that mostly is articulated through a series of choices you make as a king to your subjects. It's a very dark medieval fantasy. Really difficult choices with like massive consequences are kind of the name of the game here. In Yes, Your Grace, Snowfall, the pitch is basically follow that up with another round of just heart-wrenching decisions. But this time expand some systems around those decisions to kind of broaden the scope. So I think some of the things this game is doing really well is creating these kind of multiple alternating avenues for choices to feel both equally meaningful and just excruciating. What I mean by that is there's all these entangled resources that you're managing, some of which like enable you to explore the map a little bit farther. And you need to explore the map in order to get sort of material resources that you need to spend in order to solve maybe some of your constituents' problems. But if you spend that time doing those things, you're maybe neglecting visiting your daughter. And as a result, not finding out that her mom, your wife, is not doing too well, right? So there's all of these like interwoven consequences and threads that tug on each other, and it just man, it feels so tightly knit. Like in the first Yes, Your Grace, the pixel art here is just gorgeous. It reminds me of the old Sword and Sword Brothers, or yeah, Sword Brothers, that's what it was, game. It's not really an old school kind of pixel art. It's like a sort of let's do a new school aesthetic using pixels, and as a result it's kind of abstracted, but it also is a little bit 2.5D, and so it's just it's colorful and expressive, and I really love it. The exploration side of things I think is also pretty special because it introduces this push your luck element into these excruciating choice frameworks, which is just another way of ratcheting up your investment and tension in this game. Because if you've already made the choice that needs you to go explore to get more resources, you're going to push your luck even farther. And so it's just another way of raising the stakes that I think is a smart addition to this game. I'm not really worried about anything with this game. The only thing I can think of is it's possible if we could dip into a little bit like Game of Thrones syndrome here, where it's just so relentlessly dark and the consequences are so relentlessly bad that it becomes a little cartoonish. At least that's how I felt Game of Thrones got. I don't think that's going to be an issue here at all, though. I can't wait for this game to come out. It should be pretty soon. They say Q1 of 2025, and we are almost done with Q1 of 2025. So definitely keep an eye out for this, especially if you played the first one. If you haven't played the first one, go back and grab it. It's like cheap on sale right now and well worth your time. So that's Yes, Your Grace, Snowfall. All right, here we are, number 1. This game blew me away. I immediately loved it. It was such a thrill. It's called Haste, Broken Worlds. So the pitch here is basically, do you want to absolutely rip through some gorgeous, obstacle-filled, emerald green zone-ass environments at top speed, and then also have to worry about how you maintain momentum, kind of like you had to in the old like iOS Tiny Wings game. This game is speed, man. It is so fast and so viscerally appealing. All of that lays on top of another roguelike framework, which means the stages are quick and you get a lot of them in quick succession. The main thing that makes this game for me, though, isn't any of the systems in particular. It's just the way it feels. It felt so good to play. The way your character moves in these environments and that feeling when you nail a landing, oh my God, it's so good. Basically, your character runs, and then takes off when they go up a hill. And then you can press a button to choose when to decline at a more rapid rate. And you want to do that because the way you build more speed is by timing your landings on other hills perfectly. So you want to kind of just glide in on that like down slope of a hill, and then that gets you a perfect landing, and that gives you a boost of speed. And there's always this encroaching darkness kind of coming up behind you, breaking the world apart that you're trying to stay ahead of. And so it's this amazing race that's built entirely around how good you are at maintaining momentum. And because it's a 3D environment, you can do that in a whole bunch of ways. It's not just you selecting when to go down a hill, it's you also selecting the angle and which part of the slope you want to continue down and how far off does that throw you from your main path. Guys, it was so good. It felt so good to play. I wanted to just keep going. The sense of speed in this game is also incredible. It's just like that kind of like eye-tearing, kind of blistering thing that happens when you just can't close your eyes while you're playing a game because it's too engaging. It's that 100%. And then the other thing that was amazing about this game was the boss fight at the end of this. I wasn't, I guess, expecting a boss fight in this kind of game, but man, if all the boss fights are this like creative and fun, it's gonna be, I mean, I just can't wait. The way the boss fight works is you have to kind of, almost like Dr. Robotnik style, right? Another Sonic reference, kind of collide with it multiple times. But each time you collide with it, it relocates. And meanwhile, in this massive level that you're trying to maintain momentum in, it's chucking lava out. It's making things burn you up when you land. Like half of your choices of where to land vanish by the time you take off. It's so good. It's so good. You're making these snap decisions and you're trying to coordinate them with the direction of your character and maintaining their speed. And I can't say enough about this game. That's a Haste Broken Worlds. Wishlist it. I'm not worried about anything with this game. I guess like maybe I'm curious to see how important the roguelike systems part actually are to this game. But I don't really care because I could just play level after level of this and not have to worry about anything else. So yeah, that is Haste Broken Worlds. So that's it. 10 games that I think are worth your time that I was able to find digging through all of the troves of demos in Steam Next Fest last week. I was sort of surprised, honestly, looking back over this list to see it dominated by so much interactive fiction and so many roguelikes. Maybe there's something there to talk about in terms of what kinds of games independent developers gravitate towards. Certainly they weren't the main kinds of games I played. There were lots of other games I left off this list that were of all kinds of genres, but for whatever reason, these two really bubbled up to the top for me. And they're not like my favorite genres in particular or anything. I don't play more of them than anything else, but that's what it ended up being. Yeah, I don't know, just kind of interesting. Regardless, I hope you found something cool in this video. If you did, I would love to hear what it was. If you found something on your own in Steam Next Fest that you want to like kind of shout out, please leave a comment. Otherwise, if you got something out of this video, give it a like, give me a subscribe, that'd be amazing. Would love to have you back, especially if you like more kind of recommendation videos like this or more essay style videos. I do those here as well. So thanks for joining me. My name's Jordan. This has been the Crossover Appeal. Thanks for watching. Bye.